gave someone a playful kiss at our anniversary party, but he took it serious, and when we got home, I don't know if pouring all this out here is the right thing to do, but I feel like I'm running out of options. My life feels like it's spiraling out of control, and I don't know where else to turn. I used to believe I had everything figured out, a future with someone I loved and a chance to start fresh, but now it feels like everything I hoped for is slipping through my fingers, and I'm the one to blame. I'm carrying so much regret, so much guilt, and I don't know how to undo the mistakes I've made. I feel like I've hurt the people I care about most, and in the process I've lost a part of myself. Please, if there's anyone to advise me on what to do next, I will really be grateful. All I want is to put my life back together again, but I don't know where to begin. My name is Bella, and I don't know if I should mention his name here, but I'm going to do it anyway. My soon-to-be husband's name is Richard because I believe with all my heart that we will sort things out. Richard and I have been dating for 3 years, and we were about to take things to the next level, which was marriage. I would have to admit that Richard is the best thing that has ever happened to me in life. I've struggled for as long as I can remember. Family issues, the feeling of never being truly accepted, and self-doubt. But on the outside, I wore a mask of confidence. I carried myself as though nothing could touch me, but inside, I knew I wasn't okay. I felt like a storm was raging, an unseen one that was unspoken and entirely my personal burden to bear, and I had borne that burden for years. Then Richard came into my life and everything began to change. For the first time, I could pour out my heart, my fears, my chaos to someone. He listened without judgment, without weariness. Slowly, he became my therapist, my safe haven, and my everything. Richard had this way, or should I say ability, to make me feel like I was enough. Those early days of our dating years when I felt insecure, he was always there, assuring me and giving me all the support I needed. He saw through the facade I presented to the world and everyone around me, and he embraced the real me. It wasn't always easy for him. I know I can be a lot to handle most times. My mood swings, my overthinking, my moments of shutting down, they would have driven anyone else away. But not Richard. He never got tired of me, never made me feel like I was too much to love. In his arms, I began to feel assured again, piece by piece. I'll never forget the time I caught a nasty flu that left me completely drained for over a week. I've always been someone who avoid asking for help, but Richard didn't wait for me to ask. He just showed up. He brought over my favorite soup, extra blankets, and medicine. He made sure I stayed hydrated and rested and even watched boring shows with me just to keep me company. His presence in my life was constant. I have never been surprised in a big way my entire life before meeting Richard. I didn't grow up with moments of surprises or special moments, but Richard changed that. On my last birthday, he planned a day filled with all my favorite things. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect. He remembered every little detail about me, from my favorite kind of cake to the music I loved most, and made the entire day feel like a celebration of who I was. It wasn't just the surprises themselves, it was how thoughtful he was. With Richard, I finally experienced what it felt like to be cherished in ways I didn't know were possible. He's the kind of man who ensured I was happy with little surprises or brought my favorite snacks after work just because he knew I needed it. We didn't live together, but he came around often. Whenever I informed him that I had a long day, he would wait at home for me with dinner, ready to listen to me vent. He liked to reassure me, compliment every little detail of what I always wore. Simple things like, "I'm proud of you," or "You make my world brighter," reminded me constantly of his love I never felt at home. Richard has been my compass in a world where I had felt lost. His patience, his belief in me, and his ability to see the best in me even when I couldn't see it myself was everything I ever needed. He's the reason I began to believe in myself again. His love gave me the courage to face my past, to confront the parts of myself I'd buried under years of self-doubt. Slowly, he helped me rebuild myself, not only by fixing me, but by also standing beside me as I found the strength to heal. Before Richard came into the picture, there was Ken. Ken was my coworker and friend for years. Luckily for us, we got to work together because we were friends before we became coworkers. Ken was just a friend, but a very close one. I didn't share any personal details of my life with him, but he knew I had gone through my own struggles. He wasn't someone I felt comfortable opening up to about my worst days, but he was the kind of person I laughed with, chatted with, and shared silly jokes with. We had a little thing going on in the past, something casual to make life feel a little brighter. Our relationship wasn't defined, we were just enjoying the moment and having fun. When Richard came into my life, I knew I had to make changes. I told Ken we needed to stop whatever was going on between us. I explained that Richard was someone I wanted to build a future with, and I needed to put my life in order for that to happen. Ken told me he thought I wasn't ready for something serious, that he was waiting for me. But I told him it was too late and that we had to end things. From that point, everything settled back into place. Richard and I were doing well, and I felt like my life had direction again. Ken didn't completely leave the picture, though. We were still friends. We laughed together, drank coffee during breaks, and remained close. Richard didn't seem to mind. He understood the nature of my friendship with Ken and trusted me. But there was a day when Richard mentioned that I seemed too close to Ken. I explained that it was just the way things had always been. Nothing inappropriate was happening, and I couldn't simply cut off my only close friend at work. Richard understood and let it go, respecting my perspective. Over time, I noticed a shift in Ken's behavior. When I told him that Richard and I were planning to take our relationship to another level, Ken became more clingy a little bit. I asked him if something was wrong, but he brushed it off by teasing me about becoming a married woman. Still, his behavior kept lingering in my mind. When I mentioned my plans to relocate with Richard, who was working on securing a job for me near where he lived, Ken's reaction caught me off guard. He seemed happy for me at first, but also questioned if I was truly ready to start over in a new place, especially one close to Richard's parents. He asked if I had considered how overwhelming it might be to have relatives constantly checking in, or how everything seemed to revolve around Richard and his plans. He pointed out that Richard wanted his children to grow up where he had, that it was all about Richard's comfort zone. The truth was, yes, Richard did want those things. And I was fine with it. But Ken's perspective made me see things in another way. One day, I found myself thinking about Ken's words again, but I quickly dismissed it quickly. I wanted a fresh start, and I believed that building a life with Richard was the right decision. Ken was my friend, and he had always been honest with me. Perhaps too honest at times, but that's what made our friendship so easy. Maybe I shouldn't have shared so much with him, but we were that close, and I trusted him to an extent. Ken's opinion stayed with me, even as I continued to move forward with Richard. Our friendship at work remained the same, simple and supportive, but there was an undercurrent of something unsaid. Sometimes we both thought it was best not to address, but I started to notice how often Ken liked to be around my desk or found excuses to talk to me. He never crossed any lines, but there was an air of unfinished business that neither of us talked about. It made me uncomfortable at times, but I told myself it was just Ken being Ken. Meanwhile, Richard and I were solid. We made plans, discussed the future, and mapped out how we would start our new life together. I was determined to leave behind any doubts or distractions, even if some part of me occasionally wondered if I had truly left everything in the past and was ready for a new life. One day, Richard and I visited his family for dinner. From the moment we arrived, I was struck by how warm and welcoming everyone was. Everyone was happy, and Richard's family seemed genuinely happy to have me there, and their kindness was almost overwhelming. I got emotional as I watched everyone interact so easily. For a moment, I wished I had a family like them, but I wondered if it was fake smiles on their faces, just to paint a picture of a happy family picture. I quickly pulled myself out of that negative thought, and I reminded myself that these people were going to be my family soon, and I had to adjust. I became my own therapist and advisor at that moment, because it was something Richard always taught me to be. I reminded myself not to let my past family relationships cloud my judgment or rob me of this chance for something healthy and good. When we left, I talked to Richard about how I felt. He reassured me that everyone loved me and that I had no reason to feel out of place. We went back to our normal day life and everything seemed fine. Work was steady and Richard and I were moving forward with our plans. One day after work, Ken offered to drop me off at my place. It wasn't unusual for us to share rides, but as I got out of the car, he asked me for a hug. I hesitated for a moment, asking him why. I wanted to brush it off, but then I chuckled and gave him a quick hug, and he kissed me on the cheeks. As I stepped away from the car, I noticed Richard standing nearby, holding a bag of snacks he'd bought for us to share. Ken drove off, leaving me standing there with Richard. I could see the blend of emotions in Richard's face. He wasn't angry, but there was something in his eyes that told me he wasn't entirely okay with what he'd just seen. He told me what he just saw felt like something couples should do, and it bothered him. I immediately tried to explain that there was nothing going on between Ken and I. I reminded him that Ken and I were just friends and that he didn't need to worry. Richard said he had been trying to understand my friendship with Ken, but he felt I needed to set clear boundaries. He told me he was a man and also a human being as well, and he has feelings, and things like this affected him. I apologized to Richard and assured him that there was nothing more than friendship between Ken and me, but I kind of felt guilty because I didn't tell Richard about the undefined thing that Ken and I had in the past. To me, it was unnecessary to bring it up, and I worried that telling him would only make things more complicated. Though the thought hung in my mind, it made me question if I was being completely honest with Richard. Despite this, I found it difficult to distance myself from Ken. He was a big part of my daily life, someone who understood the nuances of my work environment and shared in the small joys and frustrations of the job. I rationalized that our friendship was harmless. Ken was undeniably handsome, but in my eyes, he wasn't someone I saw in that kind of way anymore. Richard was the one who held my heart. He was the man I found attractive both inside and out, and I knew he was the person I wanted to build a life with. Still, there were moments when I questioned if my closeness with Ken was fair to Richard. I told myself that I was doing nothing wrong, but there was a small voice in the back of my mind that wondered if I was making things harder than they needed to be. I hoped that with time, everything would settle, and Richard would see that he was the only one who mattered to me. But they say it's hard to detach from someone you once had a connection with. Maybe I should have distanced myself from Ken and embraced the changes in my life, but I didn't. It wasn't easy to let go of a bond that had once given me comfort, even if it wasn't meant to last or evolve into anything significant. I told myself that everything was under control, that we were just friends now, and that nothing more could come of it. But deep down I knew something was stirring up, and I had chosen to ignore them. Now, I remember that evening vividly. It was the night of the workers' dinner. Everyone had dressed up for the occasion, and everything was cool. Everyone had something cute to say to one another. Ken had complimented my dress as we arrived, and I had returned the favor, noting how handsome he looked. It was innocent on the surface, just like all our interactions were supposed to be. The occasion was filled with jokes, laughter, smiles, and drinks, the normal you expect when dining with colleagues. It was something we do once a while. At one point, I stepped outside to take a call from Richard. He had called to check in on me, asking if I was okay and whether I would spend the weekend with him. I told him I was fine, that everything was going well, and I agreed to the weekend plans. He seemed glad to hear that I was in good spirits. After hanging up, I stayed outside for a moment, enjoying the refreshing evening air. It felt good to have a short escape from the lively crowd inside. I didn't notice when Ken joined me. His presence startled me, but I quickly composed myself as he asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine and explained that I just wanted to enjoy the fresh air. He had asked me if anyone annoyed me that evening, but I told him no. The conversation was light, but something shifted in those moments. Before I knew it, he kissed me. It caught me completely off guard. I froze, overwhelmed by the suddenness of it, and rushed back inside, trying to process what had just happened. The rest of the evening with my colleagues felt somehow to me. I felt disoriented, and my thoughts spinned as I tried to act normal around everyone. When it was time to leave, Ken offered to drive me home. I refused, but later agreed, thinking the awkwardness between us would be less conspicuous than declining. The ride was silent at first, because of the tension between us. As we pulled up in front of my house, he began to apologize, but his words seemed to hover in the atmosphere. I don't know how it escalated, but we ended up making love in his car. I admit that was so stupid of me. I swear I regret every bit of it. It was entirely out of character for me, and as soon as it was over, guilt hit me like a wave. I don't know what compelled me to do that, but I wished I could go back in time and change things. I cursed myself for letting things go that far. As I stepped into my house, I felt ashamed and confused. The next morning, I avoided Ken's messages and calls. The guilt refused to fade for a long time, especially when I spent the weekend with Richard. He was kind and attentive, as always, and I found myself unable to meet his eyes without feeling guilty. I tried to act normal, but the weight of my actions made it hard to fully enjoy his company. I never intended for that to happen. I know I should have stopped all that. The power was in my hand, but I didn't want to admit that my friendship line with Ken was blurring until that night. During those days, I started questioning everything. Was I truly ready for a life with Richard? Was I holding on to my connection with Ken because I wasn't fully prepared to move forward? Or was it something deeper, something about myself that I hadn't yet confronted? I couldn't find an answer to it, and that only made things more complicated, and I was mad at myself. I told myself that nothing would ever happen between me and Ken again. I was determined to leave the past behind and fully commit to Richard. I believed I was ready to embrace a future with him, a future built on love, trust, and everything we had been working toward. Ken, on the other hand, refused to let things go so easily. He kept begging for forgiveness for what had happened between us. It was frustrating me because I didn't want to admit my part in it. I blamed him entirely, refusing to hear him out, convinced that distancing myself emotionally was the best way to move forward. But that day, things took another turn. It was the day of my 3-year anniversary party with Richard. We had plans to meet at a fancy restaurant, discuss and share all our beautiful memories together before partying with friends and his family. I didn't invite Ken to it, but Richard had other plans. He chose the place specifically to make the evening special. I had no idea what he was planning. I only knew he wanted to celebrate us and the love we shared. But before that, Ken's pleas became unbearable and too dramatic. He cornered me as I was leaving for work, desperate to talk, desperate for closure. I didn't want to give in, but it felt like the only way to put everything behind me. Ken offered to drop me off, insisting it would show that I truly forgave him. Reluctantly, I agreed, thinking it would be a final act of goodwill to close that chapter for good. As Ken drove me, I kept thinking about Richard and our plans for the evening. He had texted earlier, saying he might be late, but that I should go ahead and wait for him. I had no idea it was part of a grand surprise. The restaurant was more beautiful than I expected. When Ken pulled up, he stepped out of the car as well, and he asked again if I had forgiven him. I felt trapped in that moment, overwhelmed by his persistent need for reassurance. To diffuse the awkwardness, I gave him a playful kiss on the cheek to show that everything was fine and that the past was behind us. But before I knew it, he tilted his head and closed the gap between us to press his lips to mine. It was unexpected, it caught me off guard, but I didn't pull away instantly. Then he deepened the kiss and pulled away. My gaze searched his face as my heart was thudding in my chest, and before I could speak, he spoke with his voice filled with finality that was our goodbye kiss, closure for whatever we had. Then he smiled at me and he drove away. I stood there for a few seconds before I turned to face the restaurant. Instantly, I froze. I was totally shocked and glued to the spot. The walls of the restaurant were transparent, and through them I saw Richard and he could see me too. My heart raced uncontrollably as I quickly walked in. He was one holding a ring box and was surrounded by decorations and the glow of candlelight. His siblings and our closest friends were there, smiling and waiting to celebrate with us, but they saw what just happened outside, the playful kiss I gave someone that just turned into a kiss I couldn't quite define at the moment, their faces twisted in anger. Then Richard's eyes met mine and everything changed. The pain in his eyes was indescribable. They weren't just filled with hurt, they were heavy with betrayal, disappointment, and a kind of sadness that I had never seen before. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and all I could think was that he had seen everything. Ken dropped me off for my anniversary party, the man he wanted me to distance myself from, and the worst of it all, we shared a kiss. All of it was too much to explain at that moment, but I knew I had to try to explain things if only he would hear me out. Richard stood, heartbroken and disbelieving that I embarrassed him in front of his loved ones, after assuring them that we were a match made from heaven, and I made him a bigger fool because he was about to propose to me, not knowing how much of a joke he was to me. He walked away, but I followed him home. I was desperate to fix the mess I had created. At his place, I tried to explain myself. I told him it was just a playful kiss and nothing more. Also that I never intended for it to turn out that way. I told him that it would never happen again, that Ken meant nothing to me in that way. But Richard wasn't listening this time. He'd always been understanding, always willing to talk things through, but now he was cold. He told me he had been patient, that he had tried to trust me despite everything, but that he couldn't keep condoning what felt like repeated disrespect. At that point, I was desperate to make things right. Then I don't know how those words slipped from my mouth, and I told him I had ended everything that was going on between Ken and I. I told him Ken annoyed me, and we've not been talking for days. And the kiss was only a sign of forgiveness, and also to signify the end of our misunderstanding. He was bent on those words and questioned what type of misunderstanding I had with Ken that I didn't share with him, and that we had to kiss to end it. I told him it was just a casual office misunderstanding, but he didn't buy into it this time before. I saw myself spilling the truth. I thought that would earn or merit forgiveness from him because I was being sincere. I told him everything. I poured out the truth about what had happened with Ken at the co-workers' night out, my past entanglement with Ken, about the confusion and uncertainty I'd felt, and how it had all spiraled into something I deeply regretted. I told him it was all in the past, and I begged for his forgiveness, hoping that he would see how much I wanted to move forward with him, that I was ready to leave all the doubts and mistakes behind. But Richard was different this time. He wasn't the man who would become soft once he heard my apologies, who always found a way to make things work. He looked at me with bitterness, as if a door had closed between us. He told me he had been planning to share good news with me that evening. He had secured a new job for me a week back, but wanted to tell me that day, a fresh start in the new location we talked about, where we could begin our life together. Everything had been falling into place for us, but I had to ruin it. The guilt was unbearable. I could see the effort he had put into building a future for us, the sacrifices he was ready to make, and how much he had believed in us. And yet, my actions had shattered that belief. I had hoped he would embrace my flaws, my uncertainty, and my mistakes, but this time, there was no going back. His silence said more than his words ever could. Richard sent me out of his house that day and told me to never come back, that he needed to be away from me. If someone had ever told me that this was going to be my fate, I would never have believed. Update. Hi everyone, I've been avoiding this update because I'm still trying to process everything. But here it is. I owe it to myself to face what I've done, and maybe someone out there will learn from my mistakes. It's been weeks since everything shattered, and I've been grappling with how to even begin explaining what's happened since my last post. I wish I could say things got better, that I found a way to repair the mess I created, but the truth is, everything has only spiraled further out of control. He's done with me. Completely, unquestionably done. The man who once loved me so deeply he'd move mountains for me has decided that I'm no longer worth it. And honestly, I can't blame him. I should have stayed away from Ken when he asked me to, but I didn't. And now, I am left regretting why I didn't then. When he kicked me out that evening, I thought it was temporary. I thought he just needed space to process what happened. But he wasn't just reacting in the moment. He was making a choice, a final one. I've now learned that when he said he wouldn't tolerate being disrespected, he meant every word. There was no second chance, no space for explanations. The official breakup came days later. He didn't drag it out or leave me with any hope. His words, despite being calm, were final and didn't leave any room for misunderstanding. He made it clear that the kiss wasn't just a mistake to him. It was a sign of something deeper. A lack of respect, a lack of care, a lack of love. And him knowing the situationship between Ken and I worsened everything. Richard said something that has haunted me since that he can't compete, and he won't try. He can't be a third wheel in our relationship, and that kiss made him realize he can't marry me. Hearing those words felt like someone had ripped my chest open and laid me bare. He wasn't angry anymore, and somehow that hurt more than the initial fury. He wasn't fighting for me, for us, because he didn't see a reason to. I'd made him feel like an option, and now he was showing me what it felt like to be one. He didn't just leave me, he walked away from the life we'd built together. So I couldn't get him back. He's no longer going to be my husband. Wow. I'm still in disbelief till now, how everything changed so quickly and badly. Now I'm back to being alone, but this time it feels so much worse than before I met him. The life I had before him wasn't perfect, but it was familiar. It had its own rhythm, its own struggles, but at least it was mine. Now it feels like I'm living in the shadow of everything I lost. And it feels darker than my past life. My days are filled with a dull ache that never goes away. And the guilt, the shame, they're like burdens chained to my chest, dragging me down every single day. I can't sleep without replaying everything in my head, the kiss, and how it led to the dismissal of his feelings. I thought I was protecting a friendship, but now I see all I was doing, it was selfishness, arrogance, a complete disregard for someone else's heart. Yes, the kiss was meant to be playful and was not supposed to turn, and now it destroyed the foundation of trust we'd built. And it wasn't just the kiss, it was what it represented. The way I made him feel small in front of his family and friends. I didn't just betray him, I humiliated him. He didn't deserve that. To make things worse, the person I kissed, the one who was supposed to be a friend, disappeared from my life almost immediately after the fallout. He didn't care about me, about what happened, or about the mess he was partially responsible for. I've tried to reach out, to understand why he acted the way he did, but he's moved on like nothing happened. He now has his own little relationship going on. I guess it was truly a goodbye kiss, one that made me go from being almost engaged and married to being a single sad lady that's broken from the inside out. So now I'm left to sit in the ruins of my own choices. I had everything. A man who adored me, a future filled with love, stability, and promises, and I threw it all away for what? A moment of thoughtlessness? Being apart from him and knowing he's no longer part of my life is the hardest part. I can't even sleep well at night anymore. I lie awake in the stillness of my apartment, and the void of his absence swallows me whole. I am utterly disappointed in myself because this is not how life was supposed to be for me. I have no family to talk to, and for the first time experiencing true love, I had to ruin it. If only I had pushed Ken away when he asked me to, all of these wouldn't have happened. I wouldn't have slept with him. He wouldn't have kissed me. I had everything I ever wanted, and I let it slip through my fingers. I feel like a shell of the person I used to be. I've tried to throw myself into work, into hobbies, into anything that might dull the pain, but nothing helps. Everything feels like a waste of time. I wish I could say I've learned my lesson, that I'm working on becoming a better person. But honestly, I'm still in the thick of it. Regret doesn't just teach you, it crushes you first. It makes you feel the weight of every bad decision, every careless moment, every period of selfishness. And I'm drowning in it. I've lost everything, him, our future, the life we were building, and I don't know if I'll ever recover. I can't even begin to imagine loving someone else because I know I'll never find anyone like him again. He was the best thing that ever happened to me, and I destroyed it. This pain, it's unbearable, but it's what I deserve. I see that now. And for those of you reading this, let my story serve as a caution. Cherish the people who love you. Respect them. Protect what you have because once it's gone, you'll never get it back.